My name is Alina Winters. I'm 81 years old, and until 18 months ago, I lived in the same two-bedroom house in Maplewood that my late husband Richard and I purchased in 1968. We raised our daughter there, celebrated 42 wedding anniversaries, and I thought I would spend my final years surrounded by those walls filled with memories. Today, I live in a subsidized senior apartment complex 20 miles away from everything I've ever known, and my credit score is so damaged that I couldn't even qualify for a store credit card if I needed one. My grandson Thomas, the boy I helped raise, the young man I put through college, took out a $285,000 loan in my name and disappeared with every penny, leaving me homeless and broken at an age when I should be enjoying the twilight of my life. Story setup: I was born during the war years. My generation understood sacrifice and hard work. Richard and I saved every penny, lived modestly, and managed to build what I thought was financial security. We didn't have extravagant wealth, but we had our mortgage-free home, a decent retirement fund, and enough in savings to cover emergencies. When Richard passed away 7 years ago from heart failure, I felt lost but financially secure. Our only daughter, Caroline, had always been headstrong and restless. She married young to a charming but unreliable man named Peter. They had Thomas when Caroline was barely 20. By the time Thomas was 8, Peter had left, and Caroline was struggling with both addiction and depression. What choice did I have but to step in? Richard and I effectively raised Thomas from then on. Caroline would drift in and out of his life, sometimes stable for months at a time, sometimes disappearing for weeks. Thomas was a bright, sensitive boy who seemed to feel everything deeply. He struggled with his mother's inconsistency and his father's absence. I tried to compensate with stability and love. When he showed an interest in computers, I saved up to buy him one. When he joined the debate team in high school, I attended every competition. And when he was accepted to State University, Richard and I used a significant portion of our savings to pay his tuition. "You're investing in my future, Grandma," he'd say. "One day, I'll pay you back 10 times over." I would just smile and tell him that his success and happiness were all the payment I needed. How could I have known those words would come back to haunt me? After college, Thomas landed a job at a tech startup. He seemed to be doing well, good enough to afford a small apartment downtown and a newish car. He would visit me every Sunday for dinner, just as he had done throughout college. He would fix things around the house, update my computer, and listen patiently while I told him stories about Richard that he'd heard a dozen times before. "You're my rock, Grandma," he'd say, squeezing my hand across the dinner table. "I don't know what I'd do without you." When I turned 79, I started having problems with my hip. The pain became debilitating, and my doctor recommended a replacement. Thomas immediately stepped up. "Don't worry about anything," he assured me. "I'll take care of all the paperwork, drive you to appointments, and make sure the house is ready for your recovery." Caroline was going through another rough patch and couldn't be counted on. My friends from church were my age or older, with their own limitations. So when Thomas offered his help, it seemed like a blessing from above. I was so grateful, so touched by his devotion. "You might need to sign some documents for insurance and hospital admissions," he explained one evening, placing a stack of papers before me. "I've marked all the signature lines with yellow tabs." Without hesitation, without reading, I signed wherever he indicated. My vision wasn't what it once was, and the medical terminology was confusing anyway. Besides, this was Thomas, the little boy who had cried in my arms when his father left, the teenager who had helped Richard plant tomatoes in our garden every spring, the young man who had graduated with honors and made us so proud. If only I had known that among those papers was a power of attorney document and loan applications using my home as collateral. Main conflict: the surgery went well, but recovery was slower than expected. I spent 3 weeks in a rehabilitation facility before coming home. Thomas had arranged for a home health aide to visit daily, and he still came for Sunday dinners, though sometimes he seemed distracted or in a hurry to leave. "Just busy with work," he'd explain. "We're launching a new product, and the hours are crazy." I noticed little things during this period that should have raised red flags. My mail would be neatly stacked on the entry table, but I never saw any bank statements or credit card bills. When I mentioned this, Thomas assured me he had switched everything to electronic statements to save paper and keep things organized. "I've set up automatic payments from your checking account," he explained. "You don't need to worry about missing due dates while you're recovering." It seemed thoughtful at the time, considerate, the act of a loving grandson. 6 months after my surgery, I was feeling much better and wanted to reclaim my independence. I decided to visit my bank in person to check on my accounts and perhaps withdraw some cash for an upcoming church trip. The teller's expression changed when she pulled up my information. She asked me to wait and disappeared into an office. A few minutes later, the branch manager emerged and invited me into his office. I still remember the weight of dread settling in my stomach as I followed him, leaning on my cane. "Mrs. Winters," he said carefully, "there have been some significant changes to your accounts in recent months. Are you aware that a home equity loan was taken out against your property 6 months ago?" I wasn't. Of course I wasn't. The loan was for $285,000, nearly the full value of your home, and the funds were transferred to an external account shortly afterward. The room seemed to spin around me. My throat constricted. "That's impossible," I whispered. "There must be some mistake." But there was no mistake. The manager showed me the loan documents bearing my signature, my real signature. From those papers, Thomas had me sign while preparing for my surgery. Additionally, the manager continued gently, "Your savings account has been nearly depleted through a series of withdrawals. Your checking account is overdrawn, and there have been 3 missed payments on the loan." I left the bank in a daze, clutching printouts of transactions I had never authorized. The home equity loan. Withdrawals from my savings, $10,000 here, $15,000 there, totaling almost $85,000. My retirement account had been liquidated, with penalties and taxes automatically deducted. My hands trembled as I called Thomas. It went straight to voicemail. I called his workplace and was informed that Thomas no longer worked there. He had resigned 3 months earlier. That night, I drove to his apartment, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. The building manager informed me that Thomas had moved out 6 weeks ago. No forwarding address. When I returned home, I found a foreclosure notice that had been delivered that day, the first of many. Because of those missed loan payments, the bank was initiating proceedings to take my home, the home where Richard and I had built our life, where we had watched our daughter grow, where I had helped raise my grandson. I discovered that Thomas had changed my mailing address for most communications to a P.O. box I knew nothing about. He had systematically intercepted any notices or warnings that might have alerted me to what was happening. He had switched my phone number on accounts so that calls from creditors went to a cell phone in my name that he controlled. In the following days, I learned more horrifying details. Thomas had also taken out credit cards in my name, 6 of them maxed to their limits. He had financed a luxury SUV as a co-signer with my information. He had even taken out a business loan, claiming we were partners in a startup company. All told, he had stolen or borrowed against nearly $450,000 of my assets and credit. Every penny I had worked for my entire life gone, and I was now responsible for debts I could never hope to repay on my modest Social Security income. The bank records showed a pattern: small transfers at first, then increasingly larger sums as he grew bolder. He had emptied my accounts methodically over 6 months while I was focused on recovery, trusting him completely. I found a notebook he had accidentally left behind during one of his visits. Inside were practice sheets of my signature, pages of it showing his progression from crude imitation to nearly perfect forgery. It had been premeditated, calculated, planned for months or perhaps years. Emotional journey. The first night after discovering the truth, I didn't sleep. I sat in Richard's old recliner, clutching his photograph, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. How could the child I had bandaged scraped knees for, the boy I had comforted through nightmares, the young man I had sacrificed for, how could he have done this to me? What did I do wrong, Richard? I whispered to the empty room. Where did I fail him? The shame was almost worse than the loss. I couldn't bear to tell anyone at first, not my friends from church, not my few remaining relatives. I blamed myself for being so trusting, so naive. I was an educated woman, a former school teacher. How could I have been so blind? I remembered Thomas at 7, crying because the other children teased him about his absent father. I remembered holding him, promising that he would always have me, that I would never let him down. You didn't let him down, my friend Margaret insisted when I finally confided in her. He let you down. This isn't your shame to carry, Eleanor, but I did carry it, along with a grief that felt eerily similar to what I had experienced when Richard died, that same hollowing out, that same disbelief. This time, though, there was no body to bury, no closure, just a gaping wound of betrayal. Some days, anger would replace the sorrow. I would find myself standing in the kitchen, hands shaking, a plate shattered at my feet with no memory of having dropped it. I wanted justice. I wanted my grandson to face consequences for what he had done. Other days, worry would overwhelm everything else. Where would I live? How would I survive? What would become of me at my age, with no home and no savings? I began having panic attacks, something I'd never experienced in 80 years of life. My doctor prescribed anxiety medication, but I rationed the pills, afraid of the cost. Every unexpected sound made me jump. Every knock at the door brought dread that it might be someone coming to evict me. One night, about 3 weeks after discovering the fraud, I found myself sitting on the floor of Thomas's old bedroom, surrounded by photographs and school projects I had saved over the years. A science fair ribbon, a Mother's Day card he had made for me instead of Caroline, a trophy from debate team. I traced his smiling face in a graduation photo, trying to reconcile that boy with the man who had systematically destroyed my life. Had he ever loved me at all? Or had I been nothing more than a convenient solution to his childhood needs, a resource to be drained when the opportunity arose? Had every Sunday dinner, every fixed leaky faucet, every patient listening session been nothing but calculated manipulation? The thought that our entire relationship might have been a facade broke something fundamental inside me. I gathered every photograph, every memento, every trace of Thomas, and threw them into a garbage bag. Then I sat down and sobbed until no more tears would come. I stopped eating regularly, lost weight. My doctor was concerned about my blood pressure. Friends from church brought casseroles and concerned glances, but I could barely force myself to answer the door. It's not just the money, I tried to explain to my pastor when he visited. It's that I've lost faith in my own judgment. If I could be so wrong about Thomas, what else have I been wrong about my entire life? The 6-month period after discovering Thomas's betrayal was the darkest of my life. The foreclosure process moved inexorably forward. Collection agencies called constantly. My credit score plummeted. The stress affected my health. My recovered hip began aching again, and I developed insomnia that no over-the-counter remedy could touch. I would wake at 3 in the morning, heart racing, calculating and recalculating figures that never balanced, trying to find some mathematical solution to an equation that had no positive outcome. I would find myself standing in rooms of my house, touching the walls, trying to memorize the feel of the place that had been my sanctuary for over 50 years. The garden Richard had lovingly tended. The doorframe where we had marked Caroline's height as she grew. The kitchen where I had taught Thomas to bake his first pie. Soon, all of it would belong to strangers. One particularly difficult day, I found myself contemplating what would happen if I simply didn't leave when the eviction came. The thought terrified me being physically removed from my home, perhaps by police officers. I imagined the neighbors watching, the humiliation, the final indignity. That evening, Caroline called a rare occurrence. She was 6 months sober, she said, working a program. She didn't know about Thomas's actions. They hadn't spoken in over a year. He always resented you, she said when I told her what had happened. He blamed you for taking him away from me, said you undermined our relationship. This revelation was another blow. All those years I had thought I was helping, supporting, loving, and in Thomas's mind, I had been an interfering presence, someone to resent. That's not true, I protested weakly. I only stepped in because you weren't able to care for him consistently. I know that now, Caroline acknowledged. But Thomas built his own narrative. He told himself stories that justified his anger. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it offered a glimpse into his thinking. The betrayal wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated revenge for perceived wrongs. Somehow, that made it even more painful. Justice and revenge 3 months before the final foreclosure date, Margaret insisted I speak with her nephew, a lawyer who specialized in elder fraud cases. You need to fight, Alina, she said firmly. What Thomas did wasn't just immoral, it was criminal. I hesitated. The thought of publicly acknowledging my grandson's betrayal, of potentially sending him to prison, was agonizing. Despite everything, some part of me still remembered the boy he had been, still hoped there was some explanation. If not for yourself, Margaret pressed, then do it for other vulnerable seniors he might target next. That argument reached me. I agreed to meet with her nephew, Michael. Michael was compassionate but direct. He explained that what Thomas had done constituted elder abuse, identity theft, fraud, and financial exploitation. The case was clear-cut, with extensive documentation of the transactions and the forged authorizations. But will I get my money back? I asked. My home. Michael was honest. Recovery of funds is challenging in these cases. If we find Thomas, and if he still has any of the money, we might recover some portion. But often in these situations, the perpetrators spend the money quickly. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I appreciated his honesty. We filed police reports and civil suits. I provided statements to detectives, reliving the betrayal with each telling. We learned that Thomas had done something similar, though on a smaller scale, to an elderly neighbor of his a year before targeting me. This is a pattern, the detective told me. It's premeditated and professional. He likely won't stop until he's caught. 3 weeks after filing the police report, we got our first break. Thomas had used some of my money to purchase cryptocurrency, but he had made mistakes in covering his digital tracks. The transactions were traceable. Then came news that he had been identified on security footage using one of the fraudulent credit cards at a casino in Las Vegas. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings. An arrest warrant was issued. Thomas's photograph was circulated to law enforcement agencies. I oscillated between hoping they would find him and dreading the confrontation. Meanwhile, Michael worked tirelessly on my behalf with creditors and the bank. He documented the fraud, filed for relief under elder abuse statutes, and negotiated with the mortgage company for more time. A social worker helped me apply for emergency senior housing assistance. The local news ran a story about my situation. Donations began coming in from community members, not enough to save my home, but enough to help with immediate expenses. 2 months before I was set to lose my house, Thomas was arrested trying to cross into Canada with false identification. He had $23,000 in cash, a new laptop, and a phone containing communications with someone about setting up the next job. He had spent or lost most of the money he had stolen from me. Seeing him in the courtroom for the first time was like looking at a stranger. His face was harder, his eyes cold. He didn't meet my gaze. I had prepared a victim impact statement, hands trembling as I gripped the paper. "I gave you everything a grandmother could give," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Not just material things, but love, time, trust. You didn't just take my money and my home, you took my sense of security, my faith in humanity, my belief in my own judgment." Thomas stared at the table in front of him. "I want to understand why," I continued. "I want to know what happened to the little boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. The young man who promised to make me proud. Where did he go? When did money become more valuable to you than our relationship?" He finally looked up, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the Thomas I had known. Then it was gone, replaced by a practiced expression of remorse that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he said, but the words sounded hollow, rehearsed. The judge was unimpressed with Thomas's performance, given the amount stolen, the premeditation, the targeting of an elderly relative, and evidence of previous similar crimes. She sentenced him to 12 years in prison with no possibility of parole until at least 8 were served. Additionally, he was ordered to pay full restitution, an amount he would likely never be able to repay. As he was led away in handcuffs, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a profound sadness for all that had been lost, not just my financial security and home, but the grandson I thought I had known and the future I had imagined. Emotional, satisfying ending. The months following Thomas's sentencing were difficult. I had to leave my home. There was no avoiding that outcome. Decades of memories were compressed into a few boxes and pieces of furniture that would fit in a small senior apartment. I sold or gave away the rest. On my final day in the house, Margaret and several friends from church came to help. As I stood in the empty living room, running my hand along the wall where Richard and I had hung our wedding portrait, I felt the weight of grief, but also, unexpectedly, a sense of release. "I didn't fail him," I said quietly to Margaret. "I did everything I could with love. His choices were his own." She squeezed my hand. "Yes, they were. And your choices going forward are yours." My new apartment was in a senior living community 1 unit, in a complex of identical doors and windows. It had none of the character of my home, none of the history. But as I arranged Richard's recliner in the corner and hung our old wind chimes on the small patio, I began to see possibilities rather than losses. 3 months after moving in, I reluctantly attended a community pottery class at Margaret's insistence. I met Harriet there, an 85-year-old widow who had lost her life savings to a telephone scam. We recognized in each other the same wounded wariness, the same journey through betrayal and recovery. We began having coffee together after class, then dinners, then regular movie nights. Harriet introduced me to other residents, many with their own stories of loss and resilience. Slowly, I found myself part of a community again. One afternoon, I received a call from Michael. He had continued working on my case and had discovered that one of the fraudulent business loans Thomas had taken out in my name qualified for forgiveness under a recent legal settlement against the predatory lender. It wouldn't restore everything I had lost, but it would erase nearly $75,000 of debt that had been hanging over me. "It's a start," Michael said, "and we're still pursuing other avenues." That same week, I received a letter from the prison chaplain. Thomas had been attending counseling sessions and had written me a letter. Did I want to receive it? I let the question sit for several days, discussing it with my new friends and with my therapist, a kind woman I saw twice monthly through a senior support program. "Whatever you decide is valid," she assured me. "There's no right answer here." Eventually, I called the chaplain and asked him to send the letter. When it arrived, I didn't open it immediately. I carried it with me for days, feeling its presence in my purse like a small stone. When I finally read it, sitting on a bench in the community garden, I found something I hadn't expected, not justifications or manipulations, but what seemed like genuine remorse. Thomas wrote about confronting his resentments in therapy, about recognizing the patterns of entitlement that had led him down this path. I know words mean nothing compared to actions, he wrote, and I know forgiveness may be impossible. I don't expect or deserve it, but I want you to know that I see clearly now what I've done, and I live with that knowledge every day. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't sure if I would ever respond, but I kept the letter, and sometimes when doubts crept in during the night, I would read it again and find a small measure of peace in knowing that perhaps, somewhere within the stranger my grandson became, there remained a flicker of the boy I had loved. 6 months later, Caroline contacted me. She was still sober, working steadily as an administrative assistant. She asked if she could visit. Our reunion was awkward at first, laden with decades of complicated history. But as we talked over tea in my small apartment, I saw in her a determination I hadn't witnessed before. I've been going to family therapy, she told me, learning about how my choices affected Thomas. It doesn't excuse what he did to you, nothing could. But I want to understand, so I can heal, and maybe help him heal someday too. I reached across the table and took her hand, my daughter's hand. We all have healing to do. She began visiting regularly. Sometimes we talked about the past, sometimes about her recovery, sometimes just about everyday things like recipes and weather. Slowly, painfully, we were rebuilding something that had been broken long before Thomas's betrayal. A year after losing my home, I was invited to speak at a community seminar on elder fraud prevention. Standing at the podium, looking out at the faces of seniors like myself and their concerned adult children, I felt a strange sense of purpose. Trust is precious, I told them, and when it's betrayed, especially by family, the damage goes far beyond financial loss. It shakes your foundation, makes you question everything you thought you knew. I spoke about red flags I had missed, about the importance of maintaining financial independence even when accepting help, about resources available to seniors who suspected exploitation. But I also want you to know, I continued, that survival is possible. That rebuilding is possible. That after such profound betrayal, one can still find community, purpose, and even joy. After my talk, a line of people formed to speak with me. Many shared their own stories of betrayal and resilience. An elderly man pressed a business card into my hand. He ran a volunteer financial literacy program for seniors and was looking for speakers who could connect on a personal level. That night, sitting on my small patio watching the sunset so different from the view at my old home, yet beautiful in its own way, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Hope. Not for reconciliation with Thomas, or for recovery of all I had lost, but for the life that remained before me. A life that still held possibilities for connection, for purpose, for peace. The wind, chimes Richard, and I had bought on our 30th anniversary, tinkled softly in the evening breeze. I closed my eyes and listened to their familiar song, carrying me forward rather than tying me to the past. My name is Alina Winters. I'm 81 years old. I lost my home and my savings to someone I loved and trusted completely, but I did not lose myself. That I am reclaiming day by day, not despite my experience, but through it, through sharing my story with others who might be protected by hearing it, through finding community among those who understand loss, through refusing to let betrayal define the remainder of my days. There's a quote from my teaching days that comes back to me often now. The wound is the place where the light enters you. My wounds are deep, and they may never fully heal, but through them, light has indeed entered, illuminating strengths I never knew I possessed, connections I might never have formed, and a resilience I couldn't have imagined in my comfortable former life. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive Thomas. Some days I think it's possible. Other days the pain feels too raw, too immediate. But I've learned that healing doesn't require forgiveness, at least not immediately. It requires only that we keep moving forward, keep opening ourselves to the possibility that what lies ahead might hold value, even if it's nothing like what we'd planned. When I visit Richard's grave now, I tell him about my new life, the pottery class where my hands create imperfect but earnest bowls, the Thursday night dinner group where I've found friendship, the speaking engagements where my painful experience becomes a lantern for others. I like to think he would be proud of this version of me, older, somewhat broken, but stubbornly blooming anyway. Last week, I received a small check in the mail, the first restitution payment from Thomas's prison earnings. It was for $17.42. a laughably small fraction of what he took from me. But I didn't laugh, nor did I cry. I simply deposited it in my new account, a symbolic beginning to a restoration that will likely never be completed in material terms. The betrayal changed me. It had to. You don't experience such profound violation and remain the same person. But as I've slowly rebuilt my life from the fragments left behind, I've discovered that change doesn't have to mean diminishment. Sometimes it can mean growth in unexpected directions, strength forged in fire, wisdom earned through pain. My new home will never hold the memories of the old one. My new life will never replicate what was taken from me. But as I water the small herb garden on my patio basil and thyme in pots where Richard's beloved roses once grew, I find myself feeling something like contentment. Not every day, not without effort, but genuinely and increasingly often. This is not the ending I would have chosen for my story, but it is an ending with dignity, with purpose, with community. An ending that is also, in its way, a beginning. And for that, for the resilience of the human spirit, for the kindness of both strangers and friends, for the capacity to begin again at 81, I am profoundly grateful.